Sometimes, in the world of the emergency services, we find ourselves tripping over acronyms, and that's certainly the case with those who inspect police and fire. HMI CFRS, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, is an important part of our ecosystem. Led by former Merseyside Chief Constable Sir Andy Cook, although he will step down in March after 5 years in the role, the Inspectorate is made up of HMIs and teams of seconded officers and civil servants who will go into fire and rescue services and police forces to look at what they're doing and provide assurance to the public. They may set out recommendations for change, but they're not a regulator, and for now they cannot make services implement their recommendations. There's more on that in the conversation to come. I'm Catherine Levin, and as editor of Emergency Services Times, I have the privilege of talking to people across the emergency services to share what they do with you, our listeners. In this fourth series of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety, we bring you 10 conversations that we think you will find fascinating. In our first episode, I talked to HMI Kathryn Stone OBE. She is the newest inspector, and as you'll hear in our conversation, Catherine is not a former chief of police or fire, but rather has a background that is deeply framed in the criminal justice space, with experience in supporting victims and heading up regulators. She has an impressive CV and is hugely qualified for this important role, telling me that she has found the sector welcoming and is one where she is entirely comfortable. We start this conversation with an explanation about why she decided to be an HMI and what made her apply.
My granddad was a police officer. And I spent a lot of time with him as a child, and he told me regularly that if you ever see something wrong or bad, you must always speak up. And I guess it's pretty much his fault that I haven't really shut up ever since. But I like to think that kind of carrying on with a family tradition of doing the right thing and speaking up, and my career, and thank you for saying it's impressive. I don't really see it as that. I see it as a career that's had lots and lots of different things. I know many of my colleagues have gone into either the fire service or the police and spent their entire career and developed huge knowledge, skill and experience. I guess my knowledge, skill and experience is about regulation. It's about inspection. It's about holding people to account. And importantly, it's about a victim perspective as well. So that's why I applied for the role, the professional excitement, the professional opportunities, and the personal really wanting to do that because it feels like the right thing to do for me.
Yes, that's an interesting to sort of bring those two sides together, and in particular with your grandfather being a police officer and spending time with him and understanding what that was like. But obviously a long time ago, policing's moved on since then in many ways, as we'll come on to. But in terms of that, your background suggests this deep understanding of the criminal justice system. And as an HMI, you're looking at different aspects of how police forces are performing. How do you go about reconciling what you know from that and from your grandfather and what you've just described and what you see in front of you in inspections?
Well, you're absolutely right. It was a very long time ago, and the only photos I have of my granddad are black and white, so you can tell how long ago it was. And the world of policing has changed and continues to change unbelievably rapidly. How do I go about reconciling what I know from my previous work and what I see when we go out on inspections? And I guess one of the things that I'm very clear about is HMI CFRS is part of the ecosystem of keeping communities safe. We are part of the process of making sure the criminal justice system works well for everyone, making sure that police forces are the best that they can be. Same with fire and rescue services. How do they operate? What's the leadership like? What's the effectiveness like? What's the efficiency like? How do they respond to communities? So I guess it's all about evidence and the evidence that we have from the incredibly rich seam of data that my colleagues in the inspection teams collect when they're out on inspection visits. And I've just sat in at what's called a judgment meeting to determine, what grades a police force in this case should be given. And the detail and the care that's given to making those assessments, making those judgments is absolutely extraordinary. And I know that the assessments and the judgments are really very important to police forces and to fire and rescue services.
Yes, certainly is. I mean, certainly when a fire service, for example, gets an outstanding, they shout about it. It means an awful lot to them to do that. So, and also it's very impressive, the amount of data. You can see it in the reports, how much what it's built on. So it's interesting to get that's your impression of coming in and seeing all of that. So in terms of this ecosystem that you described, that HMI CFRS is part of, you've also worked for the former Police Complaints Commission, which is now the IOPC. And given the high profile of cases of police misconduct that we see, how does this experience help you with your inspection role today?
That's a really interesting question, Catherine. And I guess the experience of being a commissioner at the now IOPC was very skewed because we only saw misconduct. We only dealt with misconduct. And I know, because I know from my family and from my friends, that 99.99% of police officers get out of bed every morning to do the very best job they can. Their job is to protect the vulnerable from the hostile, and they're unbelievably proud to do that. Of the other fraction of a percent, some make genuine mistakes, and that needs to be addressed. But the others, the ones who set out with kind of malevolent intent, nobody wants to work with them anyway. So it's about how we ensure that people who work in police forces are the right people to join the police force, to stay in the police force, and where there is misconduct, it's dealt with independently, impartially, thoroughly, and fairly. That has to be right for everyone. Promotes trust and confidence within communities and within members of the public. We carry out our work, IOPC, HMI CFRS, in the public interest, and we hold that at the forefront of our mind, whatever work we do.
So that appeal process of inspecting police forces, the elements of that looks at the way that it deals with misconduct, is that something where you're looking to see that it's following a process that is set down elsewhere, or do they all get to do it how they want to and you just see, well, does that work for them?
I think it is about making sure that there is fairness and a proper process that's being followed. All of us, wherever there is misconduct, we've got to follow a proper process. We've got to follow a just process and a fair process. And that applies to police officers, to firefighters, to anyone, especially those working in public services, because they are, dealing with members of the public. They are a public profile. And most importantly to me, they are a public servant. So their first duty is to the public. And the people that I know and work with are selfless in that regard. And as I said, nobody wants to work with the people who put self-interest before their duty to members of the public.
Yes, and it makes me think about in terms of fire. So you're inspecting both police forces and fire in your role as HMI. They're starting to look at putting professional standards units into fire and rescue services. Is that the right direction of travel for fire to take on that same approach about dealing with those who perhaps shouldn't be in the service, as we've seen through many of the cultural reviews?
I guess that would be something that feels to me like an operational decision. And it's something that we at HMI CFRS might have a view about. But for me, as I said, it's all about the fairness of the process and ensuring the right people are in the job, promoting public service rather than self-interest. You ask about fire and rescue service, and I have been challenged by folks who say, well, what do you know about fire and rescue service? We know that you've been involved in criminal justice, but what do you know about the fire and rescue service? And again, I have a personal experience. I was a member of, and then more latterly chair of the independent advisory group for Derbyshire Police years ago. And in 2012, some of your listeners, readers might recall that 6 children in the Philpott family were murdered by their parents and their parents' friend in Derby city centre. And I was called to a very early morning meeting of the independent advisory group. I was the representative of the independent advisory group on the gold group for that fire. And I have a flashbulb memory of the then deputy chief fire officer coming in to the meeting, police officers coming into the meeting. They'd been working through the night investigating the cause of this fire, and they'd been working with people who were trying to remove the bodies of 6 dead children. And that I still get the hairs on the back of my neck go up now thinking about it, because what struck me was the absolutely profound and unequivocal commitment of those working in the fire and rescue service and those working in the police force to get to the bottom of what had killed these children. It was tangible in the room. So I have that experience. And I also have the experience, fortunate to have friends who are or were firefighters. And of course, within HMIC FRS, we are blessed with some incredibly knowledgeable, skilled and experienced people who've worked in the fire service. And I have to say, Catherine, I've been unbelievably warmly welcomed by chief fire officers and their teams, and by those who are responsible, either PFCCs or portfolio holders in local authorities. There are many and various ways of governing fire and rescue services, but that's been a really, really important experience. And I also went to the induction day on day 2 of my new role. I was invited to speak at the induction day for new chief fire officers and received an incredibly warm welcome from them and learned a lot from them. So I might not have the breadth and depth of the background in fire and rescue, but I'm a quick learner, and people are very, very keen to help me develop my knowledge about that.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear you've had such a warm welcome. The fire service does like to have people who have come from fire backgrounds traditionally, but I think in recent years there has been more of an acceptance that people from other parts of public sector or other parts of the world can come in and provide leadership, as we've seen in South Wales, for example, with Finn Monaghan. We've seen 2 former senior police officers taking over roles as chiefs as well. So I think the model is changing. I think you've come into a changing world, and I'm really pleased to hear you to say such positive things about the service.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
You shared that very poignant story about the death of children in Derbyshire and the way that the fire service deals with that trauma, for both in terms of how they deal with the families, the incident itself, and also themselves afterwards, looking after themselves as they deal with that. I'm interested in the work that you've done in the past with victims. You seem to have quite a focus on that. You've worked with Voice UK, the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors of Northern Ireland, and more recently as a legal ombudsman for England and Wales. So in terms of applying that victim focus to your inspections of police and fire, what you've described it quite nicely there in terms of fire, but I wonder if you could share with us any more sort of learnings from that victim-centred approach that you've taken with your previous work to enhance the work of the Inspectorate.
Thank you. And I guess victim experiences have to be central to how we judge effectiveness. And we do take very seriously victim services assessments on policing inspections, looking at everything from initial contact to case outcomes. And it goes back to a point I made earlier that the police forces, fire and rescue services exist to serve the public, and they exist to serve the public either in times of crisis or difficulty or challenge, or to keep them safe or to bring them from harm. It's a hugely important role, and that victim perspective in understanding how to improve that and how to make that different is really, really important. And that's why, particularly when we're looking at police forces, we make sure that we look at those victim service assessments from the beginning of the victim's engagement with police to the case outcome, to see where there is any particular learning or if things could be done differently. And I guess it's always in the back of my mind when I'm talking to people as I go out and about on my visits is, if I were a victim in this force, or if I were a member of this community, how would I feel about the approach being taken to this? And I guess having worked with victims for so many years in particularly traumatic circumstances, Voice UK was about supporting people with learning difficulties who have been victims of crime. It was usually sex crime or hate crime. It's a really challenging role. And again, in Northern Ireland, particularly traumatic for people who had been injured or bereaved, or who were caring for someone who was injured during the Troubles. That victim focus is something that kind of doesn't leave you. And interestingly, I was just talking to some colleagues about a child protection inspection that we have completed. And my first job, my first qualification was in child protection. I was a child protection and mental health social worker right at the beginning of my career. And that really informs my thinking about how we respond to, how police forces respond to the safeguarding of children. So it's kind of bringing all that past experience together and using that as a particular lens to look through and to inform my experience and thinking about inspections and outcomes from inspections.
And does the framework that you have for your inspections, we have these sort of 3 look-ahead frameworks for inspections, does it place enough emphasis on the victim? Do you feel that the balance is right, or do you think it could be improved?
When I listen to my colleagues presenting their findings from inspections, I'm always very struck by the care and the attention that they give to victims and how important particularly the safeguarding of children, and also how services respond to people with mental health needs. There is a very real pragmatism that's tempered by, or should I say complemented by, compassion in teams. And that's something to be incredibly proud of.
Yes, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Pragmatism and compassion. Does that allow, do they work together?
They do.
Does that work in reality?
Yes, they do.
Hard to do.
It's what I see and what I hear when I talk to police officers and when I talk to people who work in fire and rescue services. They have unique sets of skills, and they also have the ability to be compassionate and have the emotional intelligence that supports the dealing with people at times of trauma or trying to protect them from any future trauma in terms of the community safety work that fire and rescue services do, identifying who's the most at risk, who's the most vulnerable, who's most likely to fall or fall prevention. There's a whole host of things that go on to support incredibly vulnerable people in communities that police forces and fire and rescue services get very little credit for. But I've seen it and I've heard about it, and it's hugely impressive.
And does it work also inwardly looking in terms of providing that same level of compassion and looking after the staff who are doing the roles that you're inspecting? Do you see the organisations looking after their staff and providing that empathy and compassion environment for them to work into in order to get the best out of them? Is that what you see in your inspections?
That's been my experience so far, yes. And I have listened to the chief fire officers talk about in very real detail how they want to promote the well-being of their teams and what steps they've taken to promote the well-being of their teams. Similarly, with police officers, how do we promote the well-being of our people when they're dealing with very difficult, very challenging? If you think about over the summer with the civil disorder, it was very challenging, not only physically, but I'm sure mentally as well, to be faced with that barrage of abuse all day, every day. So we need to make sure that we look after people properly. And from my experience, what I've seen is people working very, very hard to make that happen.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about your role as leading on super complaints. The most recent of which was there was the Susie Lamplugh Trust's super complaint into the police's response to stalking. I know it's before your time, but reflecting on that and Andy Cook's response, who's the chief HMI, he said that change is needed and today's report must be a springboard for action. What do you think we need to do to influence change in that space?
Well, super complaints are a really important way of bringing a specific issue to light and highlighting that and really putting a spotlight on a particular issue. And I'm really looking forward to the team that leads on super complaints so that we can highlight really harmful patterns or trends. And obviously we need to work with other agencies like the IOPC, like the College of Policing. And my priority is about genuinely enhancing victim safety and confidence. And I guess the success of programs on super complaints will be measured by whether or not we can enhance that victim safety and people do report that they feel safer or something has shifted as a result of our inspection into a super complaint, whatever that might be about.
We talked a little about victims, the Susie Lamplugh, obviously, in terms of stalking. Looking at the broader role of the Inspectorate, now you came from one of your former roles as the chair of the Bar Standards Board, which is a regulator. HMI is not a regulator. And Andy Cook, the chief HMI, has long called for greater powers for making recommendations are implemented. So, which is why I was interested in asking the question about the super complaint. If that's what he's saying, how do you make sure that things like that get done? How do you make sure that the recommendations from the report into the riots last year get implemented? And there's so many of them. So I just wondered what your views are on that. What difference would it make if you could be more regulatory and have more powers? Would that be better for the Inspectorate?
I know that our Chief Inspector is working very closely with government to try to bring about their manifesto pledge, which was to give us more powers to intervene or to direct forces to implement our recommendations. And I know that he's working very hard on that. He also set out in his State of Fire and Rescue report that we believe as HMI CFRS that the government needs to adopt that approach for fire and rescue services as well as for police services. So I guess my regulatory experience helps me understand how we support improvement by setting really clear expectations and publishing our findings. And at the moment, that's by forces, services do make those improvements by consent because they are aware of our reputation. We have an authoritative voice. We are respected in the emergency services space. Sometimes, rarely, thankfully, it doesn't happen in the time frame that we would want it to. And I know that's where Sir Andy is going to government and saying, come on, give us these powers. This was part of your manifesto pledge. Let's have these powers so that we can use them. It's our fallback position. Obviously, we would want to do everything by consent where we can, but where we can't, and we see that there's a public interest issue, we need to be able to direct forces and services to make the improvements that we identify, and our improvements are based on evidence that we get from our inspections. They're not just good ideas, they're evidence-based recommendations. So I really, really hope that we get to that point, because that's one of the ways in which we can truly say that we're making a difference to keeping communities safe, because we have that power as part of our way of working to improve community safety.
This early on, Catherine is in listening and learning mode, spending a lot of time visiting police forces and fire and rescue services, getting to know the sector. I'm grateful to Catherine for spending time with me and sharing her experience. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Inspectorate. I'm really interested in who will be the new Chief HMI, taking over from Sir Andy Cook from the start of April. We'll report on that in Emergency Services Times, so do watch out for that. So that's it from me for today. Episodes of this series drop every Tuesday. All our podcast episodes are sponsored by MSA Safety, and we're so grateful to them for their support. Be sure to share, like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times.